Alright, so I'm here in the park to do a bit of a different video on Jean Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation. Now, I'm not completely finished with this work, but it has so many interesting ideas in it that I want to talk about, and I think the most important thing that Baudrillard really adds to the modern philosophical discourse is the difference between the real and the unreal, or just the discussion of the real in general. If you know anything about the cultural importance of this work, you'll know that it inspired The Matrix, which, is all about trying to escape from the unreal. And Baudrillard actually survived long enough. He died in 2007, and The Matrix was, at least the first one, was created in 2000. So he was able to give some commentary on The Matrix, and in classic Baudrillard fashion of trying to, take it one step further, he talks about The Matrix is precisely the kind of film that The Matrix would have made, or that the machine of The Matrix would have made. I have the quote written down in my book somewhere, but I don't exactly remember it. But it's an interesting idea, and Baudrillard presents a fairly negative image of modern society. He wants to convince us that the distinction between the real and the unreal, or the simulation and reality, has broken down for us precisely because we live in a discourse of the hyperreal. We live in a system where all that is present for us is real. Even that which seems to be a fiction is presented as if it's reality. And he talks about all these weird things. He talks about Watergate and Disneyland, and he goes in all these different directions just to convince us that what we take to be real versus unreal is a bit of a strange distinction. And he starts this work off so brilliantly with a quote from Ecclesiastes. The quote is, "The simulacrum is never what hides the truth. It is truth that hides the fact that there is none. The simulacrum is true." Ecclesiastes. And if you have any familiarity with Ecclesiastes, you know that this is just a fake quote that has been created, but what's interesting about it is that if you don't have familiarity with Ecclesiastes, this is precisely the kind of thing that you would read and be like, wow, this is like super profound and such an interesting quote. And the idea is, what does it really mean to be really from Ecclesiastes? As a lot of people have pointed out, the whole getting to the reality of, for example, the books in the Bible is the task in and of itself, and it seems that if we really want to gain some sort of usefulness from this talk, we have to realize that, in a sense, the reality of the Bible is, of course, what is in front of us and the message that we take from it. This is something that, for example, Bart Ehrman might say, is that we don't really worry about getting to the original text anymore. We just kind of work out to the best of our abilities as close to we can get as something like an original, knowing that the nature of this book or this collection of books is precisely that the real is maybe beyond our methods of apprehension. And this is, in a sense, exactly what Baudrillard wants to talk about when he talks about the real, which is that the real is just what presents itself. There is no unreal, because even the unreal becomes the real. He talks about the desert of the real itself, and he makes this really interesting when talking about this in the political landscape. And this is where I think the work has the most interesting things to say, is when he talks about this in terms of political theory and the way that the real and the unreal just kind of mold together into this hyperreal. In terms of giving us a little bit of a more clear idea as to what this hyperreal is, because it kind of sounds like a cop-out at the beginning. You know, we're trying to differentiate between reality and merely seeming to be reality. This is, in a sense, the Cartesian project kind of taken up again. You know, Descartes has this philosophy of doubt, where he is looking at all of his experiencing and wondering what is possible to doubt, and trying to start from first principles with this radical skepticism, what is possible to be known as the real. And you know, by the time you get done with the first and second meditation, he has this restricted at first to saying that nothing is real, and then by the end of the second meditation to saying that he knows that him as a cogito, as a thinking thing, exists in some form, whether or not what he believes himself to be, a body with hands and that's able to pick up things and interact with things and have language, whether or not that is actually the way things actually are, is something that he leaves up in the air at the end of the second meditation. But nevertheless, he comes to this very restricted idea of what the real is. And in a sense, Baudrillard is taking a larger stance on this. It's not analytical in the same way that Descartes' meditations are, and this is not to look with a frown upon Baudrillard, because it's simply a different kind of philosophizing. Critical theory and this sort of contemporary philosophy, you know, Simulacra and Simulation was published in 1981, and as such, it has that element of modern philosophy with the kind of talking about all these random stuff like Watergate, Disneyland, and fake political dissidents and stuff like that. But he does want to make this a little bit more analytic when he says, the real is produced from miniaturized cells, matrices, and memory banks, models of control, and it can be reproduced an indefinite number of times from these. It no longer needs to be rational because it no longer measures itself against either an ideal or negative instance. It is no longer anything but operational. In fact, it is no longer really the real because no imaginary envelops it anymore. It is a hyperreal, produced from a radiating synthesis of combinatory models in a hyperspace without atmosphere. And, you know, this might sound kind of like a word salad, but his whole point is that when we're trying to decide what is real, we usually have some reference in mind of what's actually real and what is a fiction. And in a sense, delving into these fictions gives us just a stronger sense of what reality is. It reminds me of Hegel's master-slave dialectic, where he's talking about the fact that, you know, because ultimately Hegel believes the same way Heraclitus does, that the universe is one undifferentiated substance that has to, of course, realize itself over time. Hegel believes that everything is spirit, and everything is this rational thing that has been differentiated through a mistake, which he might call the fall, in a very Christianese kind of way. But he would say that, of course, this is eventually going to recognize that it is just one thing. But Hegel talks about the fact that if we just have a one, spirit, we can't meaningfully have language of any kind, because we need to be able to differentiate between things. It's kind of like the yin and yang, the idea that we need to know evil to know good, and we need to know good to know evil. Hegel says that we need to have an other in order to be able to say I, in order to be able to differentiate myself from other things. And in the same sense, Baudrillard is trying to point out that maybe our distinction between the real and imaginary has gone, because our systems of determining reality, they butt up against the unreal sometimes and use it to bolster themselves. And he uses this to talk about the way that power goes back and forth with itself within a political system to merely presuppose and recycle itself. And in this sense, we can see his influence from Nietzsche with the will to power, and by extension Foucault with his kind of radical way of talking about the will to power. And before we get right into this political discourse, I want to again highlight a little bit about what he means by the real. He says, it is no longer a question of imitation, nor duplication, nor even parody. It is a question of substituting the signs of the real for the real. That is to say, of an operation of deterring every real process via its operational double, a programmatic, metastable, perfectly descriptive machine that offers all the signs of the real and short-circuits all its vicissitudes. Never again will the real have the chance to produce itself. Such is the vital function of the model in a system of death, or rather of anticipated resurrection, that no longer even gives the event of death a chance. And this is very Heideggerian to me, both in the sense that he talks about death as a possibility for us and a thing that legitimizes other things, but also in the sense that he's talking about signs and the usefulness of signs in determining the real. This is something Heidegger talks about early in Being and Time. And Baudrillard's point is that we are always presented with signs that are said to have some connection to the real. For example, I see this book in my hands, and there are a certain set of signs which seek to give me access to the book. I have signs in the sense of, I have signs of shape, of the dimensions of this book. I have signs of meaning, of what the book means to me. I have signs of discourse, of how I interact with this book. And all these things serve to give us some sort of access towards what the real is. Now, the problem is, and Descartes kind of hinges on this idea too, which is that all we have is experience. All we have is an interpretation of signs. And Baudrillard is pointing out that, in essence, everything is just a sign of the real for the real, which is an interesting idea because this is what the hyperreal means. It's just the reality of the real. It's the fact that all we know is what is in front of us. In a sense, even things that seem to go against the real of institutions of power, of meanings of words and stuff like this, actually serve to bolster them. The most interesting way he talks about this is with regards to power, but he states this in a slightly different manner when talking about the origins of idol worship. For example, in the Old Testament, it's said that you aren't supposed to worship idols, and nevertheless, some Christians throughout medieval times and the early modern period, and even today, use, for example, something like the cross or those beads that the Catholics use. I don't really know, I'm not even sure if that would be an idol, but maybe even like the sort of images that Orthodox Christians use. And in a sense, the question is, how much of God is within those images or within those idols? For example, the cross is some sort of representative of the sacrifice that Christ made on the cross. And if we go back to the pictures that Orthodox Christians have of, for example, Jesus, I even have one of those as the thumbnail for my video on the New World Translation. The question is, to what extent is divinity in those? Because, of course, I'm not exactly sure the precise theology, but there is a sense in which these have been created to help access the divine, to help give us a sense of the divine through aesthetics and things like this. And Baudrillard wants us to ask, to what extent is the divine in the image? Or is it rather that the image is all we have of the divine? He says, but what becomes of the divinity when it reveals itself in icons, when it is multiplied in simulacra? Does it remain the supreme power that is simply incarnated in images as a visible theology? Or does it volatilize itself into simulacra that alone deploy their power in pomp of fascination, the visible machinery of icons substituted for the pure intelligible idea of God? He goes on to say, in the destructive, annihilating truth that they allowed to appear, that deep down God never existed, that only the simulacrum ever existed, even that God himself was never anything but his own simulacrum. From this came their urge to destroy images, referring to those who wanted to get rid of idol worship. And this is the idea that the simulation of God through idols versus the actuality of God is unclear how we would distinguish them. For me personally, I think of authentic religious experience or spiritual experience versus a simulation of one. For example, I at one time played in a church band, like playing for service, and that was the most spiritual I ever felt. And at that time, I thought maybe this is the way that I access the divine, through music and through aesthetics. But in hindsight, I came to realize that really this is sort of a simulacra of the divine. It's the divine in its hyperreality. It's merely what one interprets to be the divine, but it's unclear how we would be able to distinguish an authentic experience of the divine from merely a simulated experience of the divine from which there's actually nothing there. And Baudrillard's point, maybe in this spiritual experience that one might experience in church through worship or something like that, is that in a sense it doesn't matter whether God is there or not, but the fact that the reality of the experience is all that is. And this is really interesting because it both bolsters the experience as real and also undermines it as having no reality below it. In a sense, it is merely real, and this is all the reality that we have access to, which is really interesting because it has that sort of circularity of a lot of continental philosophy that is both confusing and also eye-opening, because it highlights the sort of dialectical and contradictory nature of a lot of the social phenomena that we are faced with. Now, here we start talking about power in an interesting way through a simulation of an image, a sort of desired output. And he's talking about Disneyland, which is just so weird because my background philosophically is mostly in German idealism and existentialism, and in a way, existentialism is a very old-feeling philosophy. It doesn't feel contemporary, even though it is fairly contemporary, like with Sartre, or even with Heidegger. But, especially these French thinkers love to just throw out these references to all sorts of obscure things and tie them in an interesting way. But he talks about Disneyland, and he's talking about the idea that Disneyland is just kind of a simulation of an image, and in a sense it represents the capitalist enterprise in its whole. He says, Disneyland exists in order to hide that it is the real country, all of real America, that is Disneyland. A bit like prisons are there to hide that it is the social in its entirety, in its banal omnipresence, that is carceral. And this is just kind of a prelude to the real meat of the discussion around Disneyland, where he says, the imaginary of Disneyland is neither true nor false. It is a deterrence machine set up in order to rejuvenate the fiction of the real in the opposite camp. Whence the deniability of this imaginary, its infantile degeneration. This world wants to be childish in order to make us believe that the adults are elsewhere, in the real world, and to conceal the fact that true childishness is everywhere. It is that of adults themselves who come here to act the child in order to foster illusions as to their real childishness. So, in a sense, it's a sort of fake accountability that Disneyland represents. This sort of pretending like we are in a separate part of society. Like Disneyland is where you come to be a kid again. But Baudrillard is saying, well, we're all kids. There is no real world that you wake up to. You're merely in a world of desire that operates around the capitalist mode of production, where everything is trying to get you to turn away from the way things actually are, in a sense. But Baudrillard doesn't act like there's some sort of truth or falsity behind this image, behind this mask, as like someone like Nietzsche might say. There is only the simulation of Disneyland, that this is capitalism and America in its truest sense, this hyper-reality of which we are presented with this weird situation in which we try to hide from the fact that we're just constantly hiding from nothing.
Day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
Number one, and that is the only building.
It's exploding right now, Tommy. We're seeing
effectively a riot. 49 hours declaring it a riot.
5 to 50 feet by the Cal Police 1 advisor.
And you can see the two towers, a huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out.
There's an interesting idea that Baudrillard wants us to consider, which is that even apparent exceptions to the rule, such as some kind of economic downturn or some kind of scandal or a bank robbery or something like this, revolutionary acts such as these, or even something like an overthrowing of a government, is actually a way to feed back into meeting that mode of production on its terms. He says, all that capital asks of us is to receive it as rational or to combat it in the name of rationality, to receive it as moral or to combat it in the name of morality, because these are the same, which can be thought of in another way. Formerly, one is worked to dissimulate scandal. Today, one works to conceal that there is none, which is an interesting idea because, in a sense, he's talking about that these scandals always serve to come back to moral grounds or rational grounds. And in a sense, we are just coming back to the same sort of mode of production and committing a sort of eternal recurrence, like something Nietzsche might have talked about. And I think this is something that a lot of people misunderstand about Baudrillard's philosophy. I may not exactly be in a position to give a comprehensive analysis of Baudrillard's philosophy, but he's not trying to blur the lines between reality and fiction or true and false as a way to show us a proper way to act necessarily, but it's precisely to show that all we have is the hyperreal in front of us. He's merely presenting us with an apocalyptic scenario in which we are at the end time, so to speak, or the end of history, as a lot of other cultural theorists like to talk about, and he's merely presenting us with the situation we are in. He says capital, in fact, was never linked by a contract to the society that it dominates. It is the sorcery of social relations. It is a challenge to society, and it must be responded to as such. It is not a scandal to be denounced according to moral or economic rationality, but a challenge to take up according to symbolic law. And I think the point here is that oftentimes we try to meet, revolution with revolution, or we try to meet some sort of economic down spiral with revolution. But I think his point here is that this revolution is all part of the reality of legitimizing the current form of political discourse. And this is the interesting thing that Baudrillard goes on to talk about, is that, in a sense, revolution is just reinstating the thing that is being revolted against.
For the American people, by giving the federal lead, the federal government should pay directly teacher salaries, but that was not the issue.
So this was locker room talk. I'm not proud of it.
Our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Former President Donald Trump has been indicted in the special counsel's criminal probe.
Whether or not their president's a crook, well, I'm not a crook.
So this is always an eternal problem to face up against, and this is where I'll end the video, is how to respond to the reality that we're faced with. There are those who are more conservative minded who might say that this is the best situation that we have. This might be something that Hegel would say, that, you know, all that's real is rational and all that's rational is real, and we are merely in a world where the rational is sort of reflecting upon itself, and this is all part of a process. We just have to stick it out. And then there are those who are a bit more revolutionary minded who might say, no, we need to fundamentally change the order of signs and try to deal with this in a fundamentally new manner. And Baudrillard kind of presents us with a bit of a predicament, which I want to leave to the watcher, which is that the collapsing of the real and the unreal, and the true and the false, and the simulacra and the simulation and the real, all of this into kind of the hyperreal, into a simulacra or a simulation of the third order, as he calls it. It's unclear exactly how we're supposed to react. He talks about, again, how political dissidence, in a sense, functions against a certain form of politics, and by being a dissident against it, the politics is thus proven to be, you know, you're pressing where it hurts, and you are legitimizing the form of political discourse. This is kind of like whenever some extreme right-wing something or another gets some sort of pushback and uses this as part of their narrative, and it's like, oh, the left is fighting against us extra hard. This is all the proof we need to know that we are in the right. He says, is any given bombing in Italy the work of leftist extremists, or extreme right provocation, or a centrist mise-en-scène to discredit all extreme terrorists and to shore up its own failing power? Or again, is it a police-inspired scenario and a form of blackmail to public security? All of this is simultaneously true, and the search for proof, indeed the objectivity of the facts, does not put an end to this vertigo of interpretation. That is, we are in a logic of simulation, which no longer has anything to do with the logic of facts in an order of reason. Simulation is characterized by a procession of the model, of all the models based on the nearest fact. The models come first, their circulation, orbital like that of the bomb, constitutes the genuine magnetic field of the event. The facts no longer have a specific trajectory. They are born at the intersection of models. A single fact can be engendered by all the models at once. This anticipation, this procession, this short circuit, this confusion of the fact with its model, no more divergence of meaning, no more dialectical polarity, no more negative electricity, implosion of antagonistic poles, is what allows each time for all possible interpretations, even the most contradictory. All true in the sense that their truth is to be exchanged in the image of the models from which they derive in a generalized cycle. And this is complex to understand, both because of the sort of syntax and diction that is used and the way it's written, the way the sentences are elongated and almost made obscure, kind of like Hegel might do. But his point is that we no longer stand at a point where we can objectively understand political events and that we can have some kind of Glünd, as the Germans might say. We merely are in this vertigo of interpretation. And he gives us a more concrete example when he says, when Bourlingue declares there is no need to be afraid to see the communists take power in Italy, it simultaneously signifies that there is no need to be afraid, since the communists, if they come to power, will change nothing of its fundamental capitalist mechanism. That there is no risk that they will ever come to power because they don't want to, and even if they occupy the seat of power, they will never exercise it except by proxy. That in fact, power, genuine power, no longer exists, and thus there is no risk whoever seizes power or seizes it again. But further, I, Berlinguer, am not afraid to see the communists take power in Italy, which may seem self-evident, but not as much as you might think, because it could mean the opposite. No need for psychoanalysis here. I am afraid to see the communists take power, and there are good reasons for that, even for a communist. All of this is simultaneously true. It is the secret of a discourse that is no longer simply ambiguous, as political discourses can be, but that conveys the impossibility of a determined position of power, the impossibility of a determined discursive position. And this logic is neither that of one party nor of another. It traverses all discourse without them wanting it to. And this is the most interesting part, which is that when Berlinguer says there is no need to be afraid to see the communists take power in Italy, there are all these complex interpretations we could take, that he's saying power doesn't really matter, that even if communists get in power, it's not legitimate power, or that they wouldn't actually exercise this power to the fullest extent, or that he's actually saying he's afraid of power. There's all this different ways in which we could understand the reality of what he's trying to say. But in an extent, or to an extent, it's all part of this vertigo of interpretation. And he goes on to say a lot of more interesting things, but I want this to stay fairly digestible and small. So I'll leave it at that. And I really think you should pick up this book. It has so much cultural and even political and philosophical importance, and it's fairly short. It's only, 163 pages? And it is not very digestible. There are so many, I've had to look up various cultural phenomena that were something that he was talking about that I didn't really consider, or, other stuff like this. It's a fairly obscure text, but it says something very profound, and it has the same magic that something like The Matrix would be trying to talk about.